My wife showed up to my law firm opening party with her boss, holding hands and kissing, only to see everyone laughing and pointing at me. What a spineless husband you are. Then my wife handed me an envelope. Your first job as a lawyer is your divorce. Finalize it and leave. Her boss said. So I walked away, quietly canceled every payment, trip, membership, and pulled out my $90 million stake in her boss's company. Minutes later, my phone lit up with 124 missed calls, and someone showed up at my door. Let me paint you a picture of how my life went from champagne toasts to complete catastrophe in the span of about 15 minutes. Picture this. I'm standing in the grand ballroom of the Lexington Hotel, and I'm talking grand with a capital G. We're talking marble floors so polished you could probably perform surgery on them, chandeliers hanging overhead like glittering disco balls for people who actually have money, and enough crystal glasses to stock a small country's wedding registry. This wasn't just any old Tuesday night at the Marriott. This was supposed to be my night, the night I'd been busting my ass for since I graduated law school with enough student debt to buy a small island. Tonight was the grand opening of Harrington Legal Group. Yeah, that's right. My name on the door, my blood, sweat, and tears poured into every brick of that building. After years of grinding through late nights that would make an insomniac weep, endless court hours where I practically lived on gas station coffee, and whatever passed for food in courthouse vending machines, and kissing more corporate asses than a politician during election season, I finally had something to call my own. Or at least, that's what I thought was happening. Boy, was I wrong. And I mean spectacularly wrong. Like thinking you're getting a Rolex for Christmas and opening the box to find a plastic watch from a cereal box. The first sign something was off? The whispers. You know how it is at these fancy shindigs. People talk behind their champagne flutes like they're sharing state secrets, but really they're just gossiping about whose wife is sleeping with whose business partner. Except tonight, those whispers had an edge to them, a kind of electric buzz that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up like I was about to get struck by lightning. And trust me, in about 30 seconds, I was. I turned around, probably looking for whoever was catering this circus so I could grab another drink and maybe some of those fancy little appetizers that cost more per bite than most people's hourly wage when I saw it. And by it, I mean the single most soul-crushing, ego-demolishing, life-imploding moment of my 34 years on this godforsaken planet. There she was, Samantha, my wife of 7 years, the woman who promised to love, honor, and cherish me through sickness and health and all that other bullshit they make you say at the altar. But instead of standing by my side like a supportive spouse should be doing at her husband's big moment, she was walking across that pristine marble floor holding hands with Richard Garrison. And not just holding hands like they were crossing a busy street together. I'm talking full-on romantic hand-holding, fingers intertwined like they were starring in some twisted romance novel. Now, let me tell you about Richard Garrison, because this guy deserves his own special category in the dictionary under Grade A douchebag. We're talking about one of the most powerful corporate attorneys in New York, the kind of guy who probably has his suits custom-made by Italian tailors who charge more for a single button than most people make in a month. He's got the kind of reputation that makes other lawyers either worship the ground he walks on or plot his professional demise over their morning lattes. And apparently, he also had my wife. But wait, it gets better. Because holding hands wasn't humiliating enough for this dynamic duo. Oh no, they had to go for the gold medal in public humiliation. Right there, under those glittering chandeliers, with half of New York's legal elite watching like they were front-row spectators at the world's most expensive reality show, Samantha leaned in and kissed him. Not a polite peck on the cheek, not an accidental brush of lips. We're talking about a full-on Hollywood movie. I'm madly in love with this man and don't give a damn who knows it kind of kiss. The silence that followed was deafening. You could practically hear people's jaws hitting that polished marble floor. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, the room erupted. Laughter rippled through the crowd like a tidal wave of schadenfreude. And let me tell you, rich people laughing at your misery sounds exactly like you'd expect it to. Sharp, cruel, and expensive. Someone, and I still don't know who, but if I ever find out, we're going to have words. Shouted from somewhere in the crowd. What a spineless husband you are. The words hit me like a slap across the face, except slaps eventually stopped stinging. This was the kind of humiliation that settles into your bones and makes itself comfortable, like an unwelcome house guest who eats all your food and never leaves. My name, Adrian Harrington, which I'd spent years building into something respectable, something that meant integrity and success in legal circles, suddenly felt like the setup to a joke I wasn't in on. People were probably already crafting witty one-liners about the lawyer who couldn't even keep his own wife from straying. I could practically see the gossip columns writing themselves. Prominent attorney gets served divorce papers at his own firm opening. Yeah, real classy stuff. But the universe wasn't done with me yet. Oh no, this three-ring circus of personal destruction was just getting started. Because that's when Samantha, my dear, devoted wife, walked over to me with an envelope in her perfectly manicured hands. Not a congratulatory card, not a love letter, not even a grocery list. A manila envelope that felt heavier than it should have, considering what I was pretty sure was inside. Richard followed behind her like a predator stalking wounded prey, that smirk on his face growing wider with each step. You know the kind of smirk I'm talking about, the one that says, "I just won the lottery and you just got hit by a bus, and I'm enjoying every second of the contrast." When they reached me, standing there in my expensive suit that suddenly felt like a costume for a play I never auditioned for, Richard opened his mouth and delivered the final blow. "Your first job as a lawyer," he said, and I swear his voice carried across that ballroom like he was giving a damn keynote speech, "is to finalize our divorce." He paused, probably for dramatic effect, because apparently humiliating someone publicly requires good timing. "Sign it tonight and leave." The envelope felt like it was burning a hole through my jacket pocket, but I wasn't about to give these people the satisfaction of seeing me break down. Not here, not now, not ever. The phones came out faster than you could say viral video, and suddenly I was starring in my own personal episode of When Rich People's Lives Fall Apart, complete with camera flashes and whispered commentary. Some people gasped, probably the ones with at least a shred of human decency left. Others laughed, because apparently watching someone's world crumble is entertainment when you've got enough money to buy your way out of your own problems. I stood there, taking it all in, processing the fact that my marriage, my reputation, and my dignity were all being flushed down the toilet simultaneously while half of Manhattan's legal community watched and took notes. But here's the thing about me that Samantha and Richard apparently forgot during their little conspiracy planning sessions. I don't collapse. I don't scream. I don't throw punches. I don't make a scene that'll give them even more ammunition for their character assassination campaign. I do something much more dangerous. I calculate. So I folded that envelope, placed it carefully in my jacket pocket like it was just another piece of business correspondence, and walked out of that ballroom with my head held high. Let them think they'd won. Let them think their little theatrical performance had broken me. They were about to learn that Adrian Harrington didn't get where he was by rolling over every time someone kicked him. They thought they'd ended me with paper and public humiliation. But they forgot one crucial detail about the man they'd just tried to destroy. I don't just practice law. I am the law. And class was about to be in session. You know what's funny about walking into your own apartment after your life just got publicly nuked? Everything looks exactly the same, but it all feels like props from someone else's play. I stepped through the door of my penthouse overlooking the East River. Yeah, that's right, penthouse. Because before tonight, I actually had my shit together. And it was like walking into a museum dedicated to a marriage that apparently died months ago, while I was too busy building my legal empire to notice the corpse rotting in the corner. The first thing that hit me wasn't the familiar scent of that overpriced vanilla candle Samantha insisted on burning every night, or even the soft hum of the central air conditioning that cost more per month than most people's rent. No, it was the oppressive weight of all the crap, and I mean that literally, that suddenly felt like evidence in a case I'd been too stupid to realize I was losing. Take the paintings, for instance. Jesus Christ, the paintings. Samantha had insisted on these abstract monstrosities that looked like someone had thrown paint at a canvas during a particularly violent sneeze. I'd never understood them, but she'd get this dreamy look in her eyes and start spouting off about emotional resonance and the artist's journey through postmodern despair. Now, staring at a canvas that probably cost more than a new BMW and looked like a toddler's temper tantrum, I realized she'd probably been practicing her bullshit artistic interpretation skills on me for years. Oh, Adrian's so successful and stable. She probably told her friends, when what she really meant was, Adrian's so boring and predictable. The furniture was even worse. Every piece had a story, and every story involved Samantha dragging me to some boutique in Soho where pretentious sales associates with names like Sage and River convinced us. Okay, convinced her while I stood there like a well-dressed ATM. That we absolutely needed a coffee table that cost $8,000 and looked like something you'd find washed up on a beach after a hurricane. It's reclaimed driftwood from the coast of Maine, the sales guy had explained, like that justified the price tag. It speaks to the organic relationship between nature and human consumption. I'd wanted to tell him that what it spoke to was my bank account getting lighter, but Samantha had already fallen in love with the damn thing. And now, looking at it sitting there in my living room like an expensive piece of ocean garbage, I couldn't help but wonder how many other things in my life I'd said yes to just because it was easier than arguing. The worst part? All of it. Every overpriced lamp, every conversation starter sculpture, every throw pillow that cost more than a decent dinner, suddenly felt completely worthless. Not financially worthless, mind you. I could probably sell half this stuff and fund a small country's education budget. But emotionally worthless, like finding out your favorite childhood toy was actually a piece of plastic junk that only seemed magical because you didn't know any better. I needed a drink. Hell, I needed several drinks, but I'd start with one and see how that went. I walked over to my bar, and yes, I had a fully stocked bar in my apartment, because apparently that's what successful lawyers do when they want to feel like characters in a Sinatra movie, and pulled out the good stuff. Not the bottles we kept for entertaining, not the mid-shelf bourbon I usually reached for after a long day in court, but the real deal, a bottle of Glenfiddich 30-year that I'd been saving for a special occasion. Well, congratulations, Adrian. Getting publicly humiliated and served divorce papers at your own firm opening definitely qualifies as special, even if it's not exactly the kind of special you were hoping for. I poured myself 3 fingers. Okay, maybe it was closer to 4, but who's counting when your marriage just imploded in front of half of New York's legal community, and made my way to my study. This was the one room in the apartment that Samantha had never really touched, the one place that was still completely mine. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs that actually looked like chairs instead of modern art installations, and books that I'd actually read instead of just displaying for show. But tonight, I wasn't here for the ambience or the nostalgic comfort of my law school textbooks. Tonight, I was here for what was hidden behind those oak shelves, in the vault that no one, and I mean absolutely no one, knew about. See, here's something about me that might surprise you. I'm not just a successful lawyer who got lucky with a few big cases and a nice smile. I'm paranoid as hell, and that paranoia has saved my ass more times than I can count. When you grow up watching your dad lose everything in a business deal gone wrong because he trusted the wrong people, you learn to keep a few cards hidden up your sleeve. Or in my case, you learn to keep entire decks hidden behind fake walls in your study. The vault wasn't huge, about the size of a large filing cabinet, but it contained something more valuable than cash or jewelry. It held documentation. Years and years of documentation, filed and organized with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that would make a librarian weep with joy. We're talking binders thicker than law school textbooks, each one meticulously labeled and containing every contract, every investment record, every piece of correspondence that might someday become important. And tonight, they were about to become very important indeed. I pulled out the first binder, the one labeled Garrison and Company. Silent partnership documentation, and felt a smile creep across my face for the first time since I'd walked into that ballroom. This was the good stuff, the kind of paperwork that most people would find mind-numbingly boring, but that I found absolutely fascinating. Because buried in all those clauses and subclauses and amendments was the key to something that Richard Garrison and my dear wife Samantha had apparently forgotten about. My $90 million stake in Garrison and Company. Now, I know what you're thinking. Adrian, you magnificent bastard, why the hell did you give Richard Garrison $90 million? And that's a fair question, one that probably occurred to Samantha at some point during her affair planning. But here's the thing about being married to someone for 7 years while also being a successful corporate lawyer. Sometimes your personal life and your professional instincts get tangled up in ways that seem romantic at the time, but are actually just good business sense wearing a disguise. When Samantha first started working for Richard, she'd come home every night gushing about how brilliant he was, how innovative his firm was, how they were revolutionizing corporate law in New York. And me, being the loving, supportive husband that I apparently was, decided to show my support in the most direct way possible by becoming a silent partner in her boss's operation. It seemed like a win-win at the time. Samantha got to work for a firm that her husband was invested in. Richard got an influx of capital that allowed him to expand and take on bigger cases, and I got a front row seat to watch my money grow while supporting my wife's career. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. But here's where my paranoia, my cautious business practices, came in handy. Because every clause in that partnership agreement was designed with one thing in mind: exit strategies. I didn't just hand Richard $90 million and hope for the best. I structured that investment like a fortress, with escape routes and contingency plans and enough legal fine print to choke a courthouse full of lawyers. Every transfer was documented, every condition was spelled out in excruciating detail, and every single clause was written to give me maximum flexibility if things went south. And brother, things had definitely gone south. In fact, they'd gone so far south that they were practically in Antarctica, building igloos and wondering why the sun never came up. But that was okay, because sitting in my study, holding the documentation that proved I wasn't just Samantha's husband or Richard's unwitting benefactor, I realized something that made the humiliation of tonight almost bearable. I wasn't the victim in this story. I was the guy who'd been quietly preparing for this exact moment for 7 years. You know what they say about revenge being a dish best served cold? Well, whoever came up with that saying obviously never had access to high-speed internet and a laptop full of financial passwords at 3 in the morning. Because let me tell you, revenge served at room temperature with a side of Glenfiddich and a healthy dose of righteous fury tastes pretty damn good too. I was sitting in my leather chair, the one piece of furniture in this place that Samantha never tried to replace with some artisanal nightmare from Brooklyn, staring at my laptop screen. The blue glow was washing over everything like I was starring in some low-budget hacker movie. Except instead of trying to break into government databases or steal nuclear codes, I was about to do something much more devastating. I was going to hit Richard Garrison where it really hurt. His wallet. The whiskey glass beside me was down to its last amber drop, which seemed appropriate since Richard was about to experience his own kind of last call. I'd been nursing that drink for the better part of 2 hours while I went through every single document in my vault, cross-referencing contracts and checking dates, and making absolutely sure that what I was about to do was not only legal, but completely bulletproof. Because if there's one thing worse than getting publicly humiliated by your cheating wife and her boss, it's getting publicly humiliated and then arrested for financial fraud. But here's the beautiful thing about being a paranoid control freak with a law degree and too much money. When you set up business partnerships, you don't just wing it and hope everything works out. You plan for every possible scenario, including the one where your business partner turns out to be a backstabbing piece of shit who thinks screwing your wife gives him some kind of diplomatic immunity from consequences. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, and I won't lie, there was a tiny part of me that wondered if I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. But then I remembered Samantha's face when she handed me that envelope. The way she looked at me like I was some pathetic obstacle she'd finally figured out how to remove, and that moment of doubt evaporated faster than good sense at a Vegas wedding chapel. I logged into the first account, Garrison & Company's main operating expenses portal. Now, before you start thinking I hacked into anything, let me be clear, I had every legal right to access these accounts. Remember that whole silent partner thing? Well, silent doesn't mean powerless, and it definitely doesn't mean blind. Part of my investment agreement included full transparency on all major expenditures, which meant I got to see exactly where my $90 million was going every month. And boy, had Richard been living it up on my dime. The guy was hemorrhaging money like a punctured artery. Premium office leases in Manhattan don't come cheap, but apparently Richard thought the solution to expensive overhead was to just spend more money on even more expensive overhead. I'm talking about lease payments that could fund a small university, event contracts for client parties that cost more than most people's weddings, and, my personal favorite, membership fees for his beloved country club that ran about $30 grand a year. $30,000. for the privilege of playing golf with other overpaid lawyers and complaining about their stock portfolios. I'd always thought that was a ridiculous waste of money, but I kept my mouth shut because, hey, if it kept Richard happy and profitable, what did I care? Well, turns out I cared a lot more when the guy using my investment money to fund his lifestyle was also using his position to seduce my wife. So I started with the small stuff, just to see how it felt. I froze the automatic payment for the country club membership. Click. Frozen. Just like that, Richard's weekly golf games with the boys were about to become a lot more awkward when his club privileges got revoked for non-payment. Next came the lease payments for their satellite offices. Richard had been expanding aggressively over the past 2 years, opening smaller offices in prime locations throughout Manhattan. Great business strategy, except each one of those leases was secured by my capital investment, and every single contract included a clause that allowed me to freeze funding for fiscal review with 72 hours notice. I didn't bother with the notice period. I marked every single lease payment as pending verification and added a note in the system that all payments were on hold pending a comprehensive audit of expenditures. In accounting speak, that was basically the financial equivalent of throwing a wrench into a finely tuned machine. But I was just getting warmed up. The real fun started when I got into the payroll system. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not a complete monster. The junior associates, the paralegals, the support staff, they had nothing to do with Richard's extracurricular activities with my wife, and they deserved to get paid for their work. So I was very careful about how I handled the payroll disruption. Instead of outright freezing everything, I flagged all salary payments for verification errors. In corporate bureaucracy, verification errors are like kryptonite to Superman. They don't stop the process entirely, but they slow everything down to a crawl while every department tries to figure out what went wrong and who's responsible for fixing it. Paychecks that should have been processed automatically would now require manual approval, which meant someone, probably Richard, was going to have to personally sign off on every single payment while simultaneously trying to figure out why his automated systems were suddenly acting like they'd been hit by a computer virus. But all of that was just foreplay. The main event, the nuclear option that I'd been building toward for the past 3 hours of careful, methodical financial warfare, was sitting right there in front of me, my $90 million stake in Garrison & Company. I pulled up the partnership withdrawal form that I'd hoped I'd never have to use. According to the contract that Richard had signed 7 years ago, probably without reading the fine print, because who actually reads legal documents thoroughly, right? I had the right to withdraw my entire capital investment under specific circumstances. The relevant clause was buried in Section 12.7, tucked away between provisions about profit sharing and voting rights like a legal landmine waiting for the right moment to explode. In case of breach of fiduciary duty by any partner, limited or general, capital contributions may be retrieved in full without advance notice, provided that such breach can be demonstrated through documentary evidence or witness testimony. Breach of fiduciary duty. That was the magic phrase, the golden ticket that was about to turn Richard Garrison's world upside down. And what constituted a breach of fiduciary duty? Well, according to legal precedent and basic human decency, using your position of trust and authority to seduce your business partner's wife definitely qualified. The humiliation at my own firm opening? The public kiss under those chandeliers? The way Richard had smirked while handing me divorce papers like he was serving me court documents? All of that was witnessed by about 200 of New York's most prominent legal professionals, which meant I had more documentation than I needed to justify my withdrawal. I filled out the form, attached the relevant sections of the partnership agreement, and added a brief note explaining the circumstances of the withdrawal. I kept it professional, clinical even. No emotional language, no personal attacks, just a simple statement of facts. Due to documented breach of fiduciary duty, as witnessed at the Harrington Legal Group opening event on date, I am exercising my right to immediate capital withdrawal as outlined in Section 12.7 of our partnership agreement. My cursor hovered over the submit button for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds to consider whether I really wanted to detonate a $90 million bomb under Richard Garrison's empire. 3 seconds to think about the fallout, the chaos, the absolute mayhem that was about to rain down on everyone connected to Garrison & Company. Then I thought about Samantha's kiss, about the laughter from the crowd, about the way Richard had called me spineless, and those 3 seconds were up. Click. Submit. Request processed. $90 million began its journey away from Richard Garrison's empire and back into my accounts, taking with it the foundation of everything he built over the past 7 years. Game over, Richard. Class was officially in session. Morning came like a freight train carrying a cargo load of consequences. And let me tell you, the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop was better than any alarm clock I'd ever owned. Actually, scratch that. It was like having a smoke detector going off in your brain every 30 seconds, except instead of warning you about a fire, it was letting you know that the entire legal establishment of New York City was collectively losing their shit. I rolled over in bed. Yeah, I'd actually managed to sleep, which probably says something disturbing about my mental state, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up like a Christmas tree, and the numbers made me do a double take that would have been comical if it wasn't so satisfying. 124 missed calls. 124. That's not a typo. That's not a glitch in the system. That's the sound of panic spreading through Manhattan's financial district like wildfire in a paper factory. The caller ID list read like a who's who of people I suddenly had zero interest in talking to. Samantha, 47 calls. Richard, 32 calls. Various Garrison and company partners, 28 calls. Vendors and creditors, 12 calls. And, my personal favorite, 3 different reporters from legal trade publications who'd apparently gotten wind that something big was going down in the world of high-stakes corporate law. I scrolled through the voicemails for about 30 seconds before I got bored. They all followed the same basic script. Panic, confusion, desperate pleas for me to call back immediately, followed by increasingly hysterical attempts to explain why whatever was happening was all just a big misunderstanding. Samantha's messages started off trying to sound reasonable. Adrian, honey, we need to talk about this situation, and devolved into barely controlled desperation by message number 47. Adrian, please, you're destroying everything. Just call me back. Richard's voicemails were even better. The first few tried to maintain his usual arrogant composure. Adrian, there seems to be some kind of technical error with our accounts. Call me so we can sort this out. But by message number 30, the guy was practically hyperventilating into his phone. What the hell do you think you're doing? This is financial warfare, and I won't stand for it. Financial warfare. I like that. It had a nice ring to it, like I was some kind of economic general commanding an army of spreadsheets and bank transfers. Maybe I should get that printed on business cards. Adrian Harrington, attorney at law and financial warfare specialist. I deleted all the voicemails without listening to them completely. Why spoil the surprise? Besides, I had more important things to do, like making myself a proper breakfast and enjoying the first peaceful morning I'd had in months. Funny how destroying your cheating wife's boss's entire financial empire can really clear your head and improve your appetite. I was halfway through the best omelet I'd made in years. Turns out cooking is a lot more enjoyable when you're not worried about your marriage falling apart. When Michael buzzed me from the lobby, Michael's my doorman, and he's been working in this building longer than I've been practicing law. The guy's seen everything. Wall Street executives getting arrested by the FBI, real estate moguls fleeing the country to avoid tax evasion charges, socialites having public meltdowns when their trust funds got frozen. Nothing phases Michael, which is why the slight edge in his voice immediately caught my attention. Sir, he said over the intercom, and I could hear that carefully professional tone that doormen use when they're trying not to get involved in whatever drama is unfolding in the lobby. There's a young woman here to see you. Says it's urgent. Urgent. That was an interesting word choice. Not important, or business-related, or even personal. Urgent suggested desperation, panic, the kind of situation where someone was willing to show up unannounced at a luxury apartment building at 9 in the morning and beg the doorman to let them up. Did she give you a name? I asked, though I was already pretty sure I knew who it was. Says her name is Chloe Rivera, sir. She mentioned she works for... She works for Mr. Garrison. Bingo. Chloe Rivera, Richard's junior associate and, more importantly, Samantha's personal assistant. If anyone was going to get sent on a desperate diplomatic mission to try to convince me not to burn down their entire professional world, it would be Chloe. Poor kid was probably drawing the short straw because everyone else was too busy trying to figure out how to keep their paychecks from bouncing. Send her up. I told Michael. And I swear I could hear the relief in his voice when he realized he wouldn't have to deal with an increasingly frantic young lawyer camping out in his lobby all morning. 3 minutes later, there was a knock on my door, and when I opened it, I got my first look at the collateral damage from last night's financial carpet bombing. Chloe Rivera looked like she'd been through a blender set to career destruction. Her usually immaculate hair was frizzed out like she'd been running her hands through it all night. Her makeup was streaked and smudged like she'd been crying, and she was clutching a manila folder against her chest like it contained the secret to eternal life. "Mr. Harrington," she said, and her voice had that shaky quality that people get when they're trying really hard not to fall apart in front of someone important. "Thank you for seeing me. I know you probably don't want to talk to anyone from the firm right now, but—" "Come in," I interrupted, stepping aside to let her into my apartment. Not because I was feeling particularly charitable, but because I was curious to see what kind of Hail Mary play Richard and Samantha had cooked up overnight. Chloe stepped inside and immediately looked around like she was taking inventory of my living space for some kind of report she'd have to file later. Her eyes lingered on the expensive furniture, the river view, the general ambience of a successful person who definitely has the resources to destroy your entire career if he feels like it. "Can I get you some coffee?" I offered, because despite everything, my mother raised me to have manners, even when dealing with enemy combatants. "No, thank you," she said quickly, like she was afraid that accepting hospitality might somehow compromise her mission. "Mr. Harrington, the firm is, well, it's collapsing. The payroll system failed this morning, 3 different vendors are threatening to file lawsuits for non-payment, and Mr. Garrison is—" She paused, searching for a diplomatic way to say what we both knew. "Mr. Garrison is having some kind of emotional breakdown." I nodded sympathetically, like this was all very concerning news and not exactly the outcome I'd been hoping for. "That sounds terrible. What can I do to help?" The look she gave me suggested that she wasn't entirely fooled by my innocent act, but she pressed on anyway. "The partners sent me to give you this," she said, holding out the manila folder like it was some kind of peace offering. I took the folder and opened it, already knowing what I'd find inside. A desperate proposal for reconciliation, probably thrown together by whoever was still functional enough to use Microsoft Word after last night's financial apocalypse. The document was titled Proposed Resolution Framework, and was basically a laundry list of concessions designed to get me to put my money back and pretend that Richard hadn't publicly humiliated me while sleeping with my wife. I read through it quickly. They were offering me increased profit sharing, a formal seat on the partnership board, even naming rights on one of their satellite offices. It was actually a pretty generous offer, the kind of deal that might have appealed to me if I was motivated by money or prestige instead of good old-fashioned revenge. I looked up at Chloe, who was watching my face like she was trying to read tea leaves. "This is interesting," I said, closing the folder. "Tell me, Chloe, how long have you been working for the firm?" 3 years, sir. "And in those 3 years, how many times have you seen Richard Garrison panic?" She hesitated, probably wondering if this was some kind of trap. "Never, sir. Mr. Garrison is usually very composed." "Composed," I repeated, savoring the word. "That's a nice way to put it. Well, Chloe, I appreciate you bringing this to me, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to decline their generous offer." I walked over to my desk and pulled out a sealed envelope that I'd prepared earlier that morning, when I was feeling particularly vindictive over my breakfast omelet. Inside was my counteroffer, or rather, my list of demands. Not the kind of demands that were designed to be negotiated or compromised on, but the kind that were designed to make it very clear who was holding all the cards in this particular game. "I want you to deliver this to Richard and Samantha personally," I said, handing her the envelope. "Don't give it to anyone else. Don't let anyone else read it first. They have 24 hours to respond." Chloe took the envelope with both hands, like it might explode if she wasn't careful. Which, metaphorically speaking, it probably would. Her eyes were wide, and I could see the wheels turning in her head as she realized that she wasn't just carrying a piece of paper. She was carrying a verdict that would determine the fate of everyone she worked with. "Mr. Harrington," she said quietly, "what's in here?" I smiled at her, the kind of smile that probably looked friendly but felt sharp around the edges. "Justice, Chloe. Just a little bit of long overdue justice. At 9 a.m. sharp. And I mean precisely, down to the second sharp, Because punctuality is a weapon when you're about to destroy someone's entire world. I walked through the glass doors of Garrison and Company like I owned the place. Which, technically speaking, I kind of did, considering my $90 million had been keeping the lights on for the better part of 7 years. The reception area was buzzing with the kind of nervous energy you usually see in emergency rooms or airport terminals during flight delays. Staff members were huddled in corners whispering. Phones were ringing nonstop, and there was a general atmosphere of, holy shit, what's happening and how do we fix it? That made me feel warm and fuzzy inside. It's amazing how satisfying chaos can be when you're the one orchestrating it instead of drowning in it. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley who'd always been polite to me during my previous visits, looked up when I approached her desk, and I watched her face go through about 5 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Recognition, confusion, fear, hope, and finally a kind of desperate professional courtesy that suggested she'd been briefed on exactly how important it was to not piss me off today. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice pitched about an octave higher than usual. They're waiting for you in the main conference room." Of course they were. Because nothing says, "We're completely fucked and we know it," quite like assembling everyone in the biggest, most intimidating room you have and hoping that the formal setting will somehow make your impending doom feel more dignified. I made my way through the hallways, past offices where junior associates were frantically making phone calls and senior partners were having hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I walked by. The empire I'd once helped fund now felt like a sinking ship, and everyone on board knew exactly who was holding the life preservers. The main conference room was a monument to corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, a table that could seat 30 people, and enough polished surfaces to blind someone if the light hit them just right. It was designed to make clients feel small and partners feel powerful, but today it had the opposite effect. The handful of people scattered around that massive table looked like survivors of a shipwreck trying to figure out which direction land might be. Richard sat at the head of the table, naturally, because even in the middle of a financial crisis, some people can't help but cling to the symbols of their authority. But if he was trying to project confidence and control, he was failing spectacularly. His usual perfectly pressed suit looked rumpled, his hair was disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it all night, and his jaw was clenched so tight I was worried he might crack a tooth. Samantha sat to his right, and seeing her in this context, not as my wife or even as my soon-to-be ex-wife, but as a co-conspirator in her own professional downfall, was almost surreal. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of what they'd done was physically pressing down on her shoulders. Her makeup was perfect, her outfit was immaculate, but there was something hollow in her eyes that suggested she was beginning to understand the scope of the shitstorm they'd created. The other partners were arranged around the table like pieces on a chessboard, each one probably calculating their own chances of survival if the firm went under. There was Margaret Hoffman, the corporate litigation specialist who'd always treated me with barely concealed condescension. David Chun, the mergers and acquisitions guy who thought he was God's gift to high finance. Patricia Walsh, the employment law expert who'd probably spent the morning researching whether financial warfare constituted grounds for a hostile work environment complaint. I took my seat across from Richard, set my briefcase on the table with a satisfying thunk, and smiled at the assembled group like we were about to discuss quarterly earnings instead of the complete destruction of their professional lives. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice cheerfully professional. "I understand you wanted to discuss my withdrawal request." Richard cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice had that strained quality of someone trying very hard to sound reasonable while internally screaming. "Adrian, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The partnership agreement you're citing. Section 12.7. I interrupted, opening my briefcase and pulling out a stack of documents thicker than a phone book. "Breach of fiduciary duty clause. I've brought copies for everyone, in case you'd like to refresh your memories about what you signed 7 years ago." I began distributing the documents with the methodical precision of a dealer at a high-stakes poker game. Asset recovery terms, withdrawal procedures, legal precedents, witness statements from the hotel ballroom incident. Everything laid out in black and white with the kind of legal thoroughness that makes opposing counsel wake up in cold sweats. "Here are my conditions," I continued. returning to my seat and watching as they flipped through pages that spelled out their complete surrender in excruciating detail. Richard resigns as managing partner, effective immediately. Samantha surrenders any ownership claims or profit-sharing agreements she may have negotiated during her close working relationship with Richard. I paused to let that sink in, enjoying the way Samantha's face flushed red and Richard's knuckles went white as he gripped the edge of the table. Furthermore, I continued, the firm will acknowledge full repayment of my $90 million investment, plus interest calculated at current market rates, plus a penalty fee for breach of contract. In exchange, I will assume financial control of Garrison and Company, with full veto rights over all major expenditures and strategic decisions. The silence that followed was beautiful. It was the kind of silence you hear right before an avalanche, when everyone realizes that the mountain is about to come down and there's absolutely nothing they can do to stop it. Margaret Hoffman was the first to find her voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than her usual commanding tone. This is essentially a hostile takeover. I looked at her with the kind of patient expression you'd use to explain basic math to a particularly slow kindergartner. No, Margaret. A hostile takeover is when someone forces their way into a company against the wishes of existing management. This is the natural consequence of existing management making catastrophically bad decisions about their personal lives. David Chun tried next, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. You can't just walk in here and steal our firm because your marriage fell apart. I'm not stealing anything, I replied calmly. I'm collecting on an investment that was predicated on trust and professional conduct. When that trust was violated, publicly and deliberately, the terms of our agreement kicked in automatically. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with your lawyers. Oh wait, you are lawyers. How's that working out for you? Patricia Walsh, who'd been furiously scribbling notes during the entire conversation, looked up with the desperate expression of someone grasping at legal straws. There has to be some kind of arbitration process, some way to negotiate. There is, I said, sliding another document across the table. It's called signing these papers and accepting reality. You have until 5 p.m. today. One by one, I watched them realize that there was no way out, no legal loophole, no brilliant strategy that would save them from the consequences of their own actions. Richard's empire, built on my money and sustained by my trust, was crumbling because he couldn't keep his hands off my wife. The pen in Richard's hand shook like he was trying to defuse a bomb as he signed the first page. Then Samantha, her signature barely legible as her hand trembled. Then the partners, each one acknowledging that their comfortable, profitable world had just been turned upside down by a man they'd thought was too civilized to fight back. When it was over, when the last signature was on the last page and the documents were safely back in my briefcase, I stood up and straightened my tie. Congratulations, I said, looking around the room at the faces of people who'd just learned a very expensive lesson about underestimating the quiet guy in the corner. You've just experienced justice. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in front of a building in Brooklyn that looked like it had been through a war and lost. The paint was peeling off the brick facade like a bad sunburn. The windows were covered with steel grates that had seen better decades, and the whole place had that urban decay meets stubborn determination vibe that you usually find in neighborhoods where gentrification hasn't quite figured out how to charge $15 for artisanal coffee yet. This was not the kind of place where Adrian Harrington, newly minted owner of Garrison and Company, usually conducted business meetings. My usual haunts involved marble lobbies, doormen who knew your name and your coffee order, and conference rooms with views that cost more per square foot than most people's annual salaries. But Patricia Wells had specifically recommended this place, and when a woman with Patricia's reputation for cutting through legal bullshit tells you to check something out, you listen. Patricia Wells was the kind of lawyer who made other lawyers nervous at cocktail parties. She'd been practicing law since before I was old enough to spell litigation, and she had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in pursuit of what she considered justice. She was also one of the few people in New York's legal community who'd never treated me like Samantha's ambitious but ultimately harmless husband. When I called her after the boardroom massacre to ask for advice about what to do with my newly acquired empire, she'd given me an address in Brooklyn and told me to go see what real lawyers look like. The sign above the door read, Unity Legal Collective, in letters that had probably been painted by hand sometime during the Clinton administration. It wasn't exactly inspiring confidence in terms of professional polish, but there was something honest about it that I'd been missing in my world of glass towers and expense accounts. I pushed through the door and immediately felt like I'd stepped into a parallel universe where law was practiced by people who actually gave a damn about their clients instead of their billable hours. The reception area, and I'm being generous calling it that, was basically a folding table with a computer that looked like it had survived Y2K and a phone that definitely predated smartphones. But the walls were covered with newspaper clippings, thank you letters, and photographs that told the story of a legal practice that measured success in lives changed rather than dollars earned. "Can I help you?" asked a young woman behind the desk, who looked like she hadn't slept in about 3 days, but was still managing to project an energy that could power half of Manhattan. "I'm looking for Isabella Torres," I said, suddenly feeling overdressed in my $1,000 suit. "That's me," she said, standing up and extending a hand that had ink stains on the fingers and calluses that suggested she did more than just shuffle paperwork. "And you must be Mr. Harrington. Patricia said you might be stopping by." Isabella Torres was not what I'd expected, though to be honest, I wasn't sure what I had expected. She was probably in her early 30s, with the kind of fierce eyes that suggested she'd stared down more than a few corporate lawyers in her time, and she moved with the quick, efficient energy of someone who had about 17 different crises to manage and only enough time to handle 12 of them properly. She led me through a maze of cubicles where young lawyers were hunched over computers that belonged in a museum, phones pressed to their ears as they tried to navigate bureaucratic nightmares on behalf of clients who couldn't afford to hire the kind of firms that charged $400 an hour for the privilege of putting you on hold. "Sorry about the chaos," Isabella said over her shoulder as we passed a cubicle where 2 lawyers were debating something in rapid-fire Spanish while surrounded by stacks of paperwork that reached toward the ceiling. "We're handling about 3 times as many cases as we should be, but we can't exactly turn people away when they need help." We ended up in her office, which was basically a converted storage closet with a window that looked out on a brick wall. The desk was buried under case files. The bookshelf was held together with duct tape, and there was a coffee maker in the corner that looked like it had been salvaged from a dumpster behind a truck stop. "Coffee?" she offered, gesturing toward the machine with the kind of resigned expression that suggested she knew the answer was probably no. "Sure," I said, because sometimes you have to commit to the experience, even when the experience might involve food poisoning. She poured 2 cups of what might generously be called coffee and handed me one while settling into her chair, which squeaked like it was protesting the very concept of supporting human weight. "So," she said, leaning back and fixing me with those fierce eyes, "Patricia tells me you just acquired one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms, and you're looking for advice on what to do with it. That's not usually the kind of problem that brings people to Brooklyn." I took a sip of the coffee, which was somehow both bitter and flavorless at the same time, and tried to figure out how to explain what I was doing here without sounding like some rich asshole having a midlife crisis. "I'm having what you might call a philosophical moment," I said finally. "For the past 2 weeks, I've been running a firm that specializes in helping corporations get richer and more powerful, and I'm starting to wonder if there might be better ways to use a law degree." Isabella laughed, and it wasn't a polite, professional laugh. It was the kind of genuine amusement that comes from hearing something unexpectedly honest. "A philosophical moment. That's one way to put it. What would you do with $15 million? The question came out of nowhere, direct and blunt, like she was testing whether I was serious or just slumming it in Brooklyn for the novelty of seeing how the other half lived. "Excuse me," I said. "Hypothetically," she said, leaning forward with an intensity that made it clear this wasn't really hypothetical at all. "If someone walked in here right now and handed you $15 million to spend on legal services for people who actually need them, what would you do with it?" I set down my coffee cup and looked around her cramped office, at the duct-taped bookshelf and the squeaky chair and the stacks of cases representing people who couldn't afford justice in a system that increasingly treated it like a luxury commodity. "What would you do?" I asked. Isabella didn't hesitate for even a second, like she'd been planning for this exact moment since she'd passed the bar exam. "Hire 50 lawyers, open legal clinics in every borough, provide free representation for tenant disputes, immigration cases, workers' rights violations." Go to war against the firms that crush families because they can afford better lawyers. The passion in her voice was infectious, the kind of raw determination that reminded me why I'd wanted to be a lawyer in the first place, back when I thought the legal system was about justice instead of just another way for rich people to stay rich. That's a good plan, I said quietly. Yeah, well, good plans don't pay the rent, she replied, gesturing around the office that was clearly held together by hope and stubbornness in equal measure. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my checkbook, the same one I'd used to make Richard Garrison's life miserable 2 weeks ago. This time, though, I was going to use it for something that might actually make the world a little bit better. I wrote out a check for $15 million, tore it off, and handed it across the desk to Isabella Torres, who stared at it like I'd just handed her a live grenade. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. "Justice," I said, standing up and extending my hand. "Or at least a down payment on it." For the first time since the night my marriage exploded in public, I felt something other than anger or satisfaction. I felt hope. And judging by the way Isabella was staring at that check with tears in her eyes, I wasn't the only one. 3 days after I'd essentially bought myself a small army of idealistic lawyers in Brooklyn, my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't expected to see. Samantha. Not Richard, not one of the partners, not even Chloe, with another desperate message from the firm's new overlords. My soon-to-be ex-wife, calling me directly like we were still people who had normal conversations instead of two combatants in a very expensive war. I let it ring 4 times before answering, because even in the middle of a philosophical renaissance about the nature of justice, I wasn't above a little psychological warfare. "Samantha," I said, not bothering with pleasantries like hello, or how are you holding up after I destroyed your boyfriend's empire. "Adrian." Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow, like the woman who'd kissed Richard under those chandeliers had been replaced by someone who was finally beginning to understand the consequences of her actions. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked, settling back in my chair and enjoying the fact that for once in our marriage, I held all the cards. "Because last time we talked, you handed me divorce papers in front of 200 people and told me to sign them." I'm pretty sure that conversation covered everything we needed to discuss. There was a pause, and I could practically hear her trying to figure out how to approach this without making things worse for herself. "There's going to be a press statement. About the firm, about what happened. I thought you should know." A press statement. Of course there was going to be a press statement. You can't have a Manhattan law firm implode spectacularly without someone trying to control the narrative, spin the story, make it sound like it was all part of some grand strategic plan instead of the natural consequence of 2 people thinking with their genitals instead of their brains. "What kind of press statement?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. "Corporate restructuring," she said, and I could hear the carefully rehearsed language in her voice. "Richard is stepping back to focus on strategic initiatives. I'm transitioning to a consulting role to pursue new opportunities. The firm is bringing in fresh leadership to guide the next phase of growth." I actually laughed out loud at that. Fresh leadership. Is that what we're calling it when someone forcibly takes over a company after the previous management screws his wife? "Adrian, please." "No," I interrupted, and there was an edge in my voice that surprised even me. "No more spin. No more corporate bullshit. No more pretending that what happened was anything other than what it was. You want to make a press statement? Fine. But you're going to tell the truth." Another pause, longer this time. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're going to admit that the firm's financial crisis was caused by a breach of fiduciary duty. You're going to acknowledge that I provided the capital that kept Garrison and company operating for 7 years. And you're going to explain why my investment was withdrawn. That would destroy Richard's reputation," she said quietly. "Samantha," I replied, and my voice was probably colder than it had any right to be. "Richard's reputation was destroyed the moment he decided to fuck my wife in public. I'm just making sure everyone knows why." She was quiet for so long that I started to wonder if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Can we meet? In person? Somewhere neutral?" That was interesting. After weeks of lawyers and intermediaries and carefully worded legal documents, she wanted to sit down face to face and have an actual conversation. Either she was planning some kind of last-ditch attempt to manipulate me, or she was finally ready to stop pretending that any of this could be fixed with the right spin and enough money. "Fine," I said. but not somewhere you choose, not somewhere Richard chooses, and definitely not anywhere with crystal chandeliers. An hour later, I was sitting in a cafe in the village that looked like it had been decorated by someone who thought ambience meant as many mismatched chairs and random vintage posters as possible. It was the kind of place where the coffee was actually good instead of just expensive, where the baristas had real tattoos instead of the carefully curated kind that rich people get to prove they're still edgy, and where nobody gave a damn about your net worth or your legal pedigree. Samantha walked in 20 minutes late, which was typical for her even under normal circumstances. She looked around the cafe like she'd never seen anything quite like it, which was probably true. This wasn't exactly the kind of establishment that appeared on Upper East Side restaurant guides or got featured in lifestyle magazines about where successful couples should be seen. She'd dressed down for the occasion, trading her usual designer outfits for jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than most people's rent, but at least didn't scream, "I marry my paychecks to Manhattan law firms." Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, her makeup was minimal, and for a moment, she almost looked like the woman I'd married 7 years ago, back when we were both young and stupid and thought we could conquer the world together. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, settling into the chair across from me with the kind of careful movements that suggested she was afraid one wrong gesture might set off another round of financial warfare. "You wanted to talk about the press statement," I said, not bothering to make this easy for her. "So talk." She pulled out a folder, because of course she brought paperwork to what was supposed to be an emotional conversation, and slid a draft across the table. "Richard's PR team put this together. I thought you should see it before it goes out." I read through the document, and it was exactly as awful as I'd expected. Corporate doublespeak dressed up as transparency, carefully crafted language that acknowledged recent changes in firm leadership without actually explaining what those changes were or why they'd happened. It painted Richard as a visionary stepping back to focus on broader strategic initiatives, and me as a valuable partner assuming expanded responsibilities. It was fiction, basically, the kind of sanitized version of events that let everyone save face and pretend that nothing embarrassing had actually occurred. "This is bullshit," I said, sliding it back across the table. "What do you want it to say?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that suggested this wasn't entirely a hostile negotiation anymore. For the next 2 hours, we went through that press statement line by line, cutting through the corporate speak and replacing it with something that actually resembled the truth. It was weird, having a civil conversation with the woman who destroyed our marriage, but there was something almost therapeutic about forcing her to confront the reality of what had happened instead of hiding behind lawyers and PR consultants. She admitted that I had been the primary financial backer of Garrison and Company. She acknowledged that the firm's recent difficulties were related to personal conduct issues that had affected the partnership structure. She even agreed to a line about how the transition represented accountability for actions that violated both professional and personal trust. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was honest in a way that Manhattan legal press releases usually weren't. As we were finishing up, she looked across the table at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Not the calculating look of someone trying to get what she wanted, but something that might have been actual regret. "Did you ever love me, Adrian?" she asked quietly, and for a moment she sounded like the woman I'd married instead of the stranger who'd handed me divorce papers under those chandeliers. I looked at her for a long moment. This person who'd been the center of my world for 7 years and was now essentially a hostile witness in the legal proceedings of my own life. "Yes," I said finally. "But not the version of you who thought betrayal was a strategy." The press statement went live at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, and by 10 a.m., the legal world had officially lost its collective mind. I was sitting in my apartment, drinking the kind of expensive coffee that tastes like it was personally blessed by Colombian monks, when my phone started buzzing with notifications like a slot machine hitting the jackpot. Except instead of coins, it was spitting out headlines that read like the fever dreams of a gossip columnist who'd been mainlining legal drama. "Power couple implodes. $90 million withdrawal leaves Garrison and Co. in ruins. From marriage to merger. How infidelity toppled a Manhattan law empire. The most expensive divorce in legal history. Attorney uses own fortune to destroy cheating wife's lover." That last one was from the New York Legal Tribune. And I had to admit they'd nailed the essence of the story in a way that made me slightly proud and slightly horrified at the same time. It's one thing to orchestrate someone's professional destruction. It's another thing entirely to see it laid out in headlines that would probably be taught in law school ethics courses for the next decade. The statement that Samantha and I had hammered out over bad cafe coffee had apparently been like throwing gasoline on a fire that was already consuming everything in its path. The carefully worded acknowledgments of personal conduct issues and violations of professional trust were being dissected by legal bloggers like forensic evidence in a murder trial. Every phrase was being analyzed, every euphemism was being decoded, and every implication was being spelled out in increasingly dramatic language. But the real fireworks weren't happening in the press. They were happening on social media, where the story had taken on a life of its own like some kind of digital wildfire. Twitter was absolutely savage, because apparently nothing brings out people's inner literary critic quite like a good old-fashioned public humiliation story with a financial warfare twist. Adrian Harrington just proved that revenge is a dish best served with quarterly earnings reports, had gotten about 15,000 retweets. Imagine being so bad at cheating that you accidentally give your husband control of your boyfriend's entire company. Was trending with a hashtag that I'm not going to repeat, but involved creative uses of legal terminology. My personal favorite was from a law student at Columbia. Note to self: before screwing my boss, make sure my husband isn't a silent partner with withdrawal clauses. The memes were even better. Someone had created a version of the distracted boyfriend meme where the boyfriend was labeled Samantha, the girlfriend was Adrian's $90 million, and the other woman was Richard's ego. Another one showed a guy pushing a domino labeled public affair that knocked over increasingly larger dominoes, ending with complete financial collapse of Manhattan law firm. But while social media was having a field day with my personal drama, the real damage was happening in the professional sphere, where Richard Garrison's reputation was being systematically destroyed by people who'd been waiting years for an excuse to take him down a few pegs. The New York State Bar Association issued a statement about maintaining professional standards in personal relationships. That was lawyer speak for holy shit, what an idiot, but delivered with the kind of diplomatic language that let everyone pretend they were taking the high road while absolutely eviscerating someone's career. 3 different legal ethics professors were quoted in various publications, all saying essentially the same thing: that using your position as a senior partner to conduct an affair with a subordinate spouse represented such a fundamental violation of professional boundaries that it basically invalidated any claim to ethical leadership. One of them, from Harvard Law, actually used the phrase textbook example of how personal conduct can undermine fiduciary responsibility, which was probably going to end up in actual textbooks within the year. But the real knife twist came from the financial press, where reporters who specialized in corporate mergers and acquisitions were having an absolute field day explaining exactly how Richard had managed to lose control of his own firm. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece titled "The Art of the Corporate Takeover," a case study in strategic patience, which made me sound like some kind of financial mastermind instead of a guy who'd just gotten really pissed off and decided to weaponize his investment portfolio. The article detailed how I'd structured my original investment with enough escape clauses to essentially guarantee control if the partnership went sideways. They interviewed business school professors who called it brilliantly predatory and a masterclass in defensive corporate strategy. One Harvard Business Review contributor described it as the most elegant hostile takeover in recent memory, which made it sound like I'd planned this whole thing from the beginning instead of just being really paranoid about trusting people with my money. By noon, investors were fleeing anything connected to Richard Garrison like he had some kind of contagious financial disease. 2 pension funds that had invested in Garrison and Company's expansion pulled their funding. 3 major corporate clients announced they were reviewing their legal representation needs, which was corporate speak for, "We're firing you before this clusterfuck spreads to our own reputations." The cascading effect was beautiful in its ruthless efficiency. Staff members began resigning in waves, not because they were being fired, but because having Garrison and Company on your resume was suddenly about as valuable as having Enron or Lehman Brothers on your business card. Junior associates were frantically networking to find positions at firms that weren't currently imploding. Senior partners were quietly reaching out to headhunters about new opportunities in legal leadership. Even the building's management company got nervous. The Garrison and Company. Offices were on the 32nd floor of one of those gleaming Manhattan towers where prestige addresses came with prestige rent payments. And apparently, there were some concerns about whether those rent payments were going to keep coming. I heard through the legal grapevine that building management had actually called to confirm the status of the lease agreement, which was landlord speak for, "Please tell us you can still afford this ridiculous rent." But while Richard's world was collapsing around him like a house of cards in a hurricane, something interesting was happening to my phone. Instead of angry voicemails and desperate pleas for mercy, I was getting calls from people who wanted to work with me. Columbia Law School called to invite me to guest lecture on corporate partnership structures. The New York State Bar Association wanted me to serve on their ethics advisory committee. 3 different mayors' offices reached out about consulting on small business legal initiatives. It was surreal, going from being the guy whose wife publicly cheated on him to being the guy who turned that humiliation into the most talked-about corporate takeover of the year. Legal headhunters were calling with offers to represent Fortune 500 companies who were apparently impressed by my strategic thinking under pressure. 2 different publishers wanted to discuss book deals about entrepreneurial approaches to justice in corporate law. The most interesting call came from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to make a movie about the intersection of personal betrayal and financial warfare in modern legal practice. She explained that she'd been following corporate corruption stories for years, but she'd never seen anything quite like someone using their own investment as a weapon against personal betrayal. "It's like a Greek tragedy," she said, "but with better lawyers and more detailed financial documentation." While I was fielding calls from people who suddenly thought I was some kind of business genius, Richard had apparently gone into hiding. According to the gossip network that operates faster than fiber optic internet in Manhattan legal circles, he hadn't been seen in public since the press statement went live. His assistant was telling everyone who called that he was unavailable for comment due to the ongoing transition. But sources close to the firm were saying he basically barricaded himself in his apartment and wasn't taking calls from anyone, including his own lawyers. Samantha had also vanished from public view, though in her case, it was probably strategic rather than panic-induced. Someone with her PR instincts would know that the best thing to do when you're the other woman in a story this big is to disappear completely and hope people get distracted by something else before you have to show your face in professional settings again. As I sat in my apartment, watching my phone light up with opportunities that I never would have had if my marriage hadn't exploded in the most public way possible, I realized something that was either profound or deeply twisted. This was the best thing that had ever happened to my career. That evening, as I was settling into what had become my new routine of ignoring phone calls from reporters and reading increasingly dramatic headlines about my own life, someone knocked on my door. Not the polite buzz from the lobby that meant Michael had screened another visitor, but an actual knock on my apartment door, which meant someone had either gotten past building security or had been personally escorted up by someone with access. I opened the door to find Dr. Camille Rhodes standing in my hallway, looking like she'd just stepped out of one of those academic conferences where brilliant people gather to discuss why the world is terrible and what we might theoretically do about it if anyone actually listened to academics. She was holding a leather messenger bag that looked like it had survived several decades of intellectual warfare, and she had that particular expression that professors get when they've discovered something fascinating that they absolutely have to share with someone immediately. "Adrian Harrington," she said, extending her hand with the kind of confident grip that suggested she was used to being the smartest person in most rooms. "Dr. Camille Rhodes, Columbia Law School. I teach ethics and corporate responsibility, and I need to talk to you about what you've done." Now, when someone introduces themselves as an ethics professor and says they need to talk to you about your recent actions, it's usually not because they want to nominate you for Humanitarian of the Year. My first instinct was to assume I was about to get a lecture about the moral implications of using financial warfare as a response to personal betrayal, complete with citations from legal philosophy texts that would make my head hurt. "Dr. Rhodes," I said, stepping aside to let her in because curiosity had always been one of my more dangerous traits. "I'm guessing this isn't a social call." "Actually," she said, looking around my apartment with the kind of analytical gaze that suggested she was taking notes for future reference. It's exactly a social call, but probably not the kind you're expecting. She settled into one of my chairs, one of the few pieces of furniture that Samantha hadn't insisted on replacing with something that looked like modern art, having a nervous breakdown, and pulled out a tablet that was covered with what appeared to be legal documents, news articles, and academic papers. "I want to study your withdrawal strategy," she said without any of the diplomatic buildup that most people use when they're about to ask you to become a case study. What you did to Richard Garrison represents one of the most elegant examples of corporate accountability through contractual enforcement that I've seen in 20 years of academic research. I poured myself a drink, because conversations with ethics professors seemed like the kind of thing that required alcohol, and offered her one, which she accepted with the casual grace of someone who'd spent enough time around lawyers to know that business discussions and beverages often went together. "You want to study me like a lab rat," I said, settling into my own chair and trying to figure out whether I should be flattered or concerned. "I want to study your strategy like a legal scholar," she corrected, and her smile had just enough mischief in it to suggest that she wasn't your typical dry academic. "You've essentially created a new model for how personal conduct violations can be addressed through existing corporate structures. Do you have any idea how revolutionary that is?" For the next 3 hours, we talked about law in a way that I hadn't since law school, not as a tool for making money or winning cases, but as a framework for actually creating justice in situations where the traditional system had failed. Camille had theories about corporate accountability that made my revenge plot sound like a footnote in some larger academic discussion about power structures and ethical enforcement. She laughed at my dry observations about the legal profession with the kind of genuine appreciation that suggested she'd been dealing with overly serious academics for too long. When I described Richard's face during the boardroom confrontation, she actually snorted with laughter and said, "I would have paid tuition money to see that." But what really impressed me was that she wasn't treating what I'd done like some kind of aberration or cautionary tale. To her, it was proof that creative legal thinking could be used to address systemic problems that traditional approaches couldn't touch. She talked about power imbalances in corporate partnerships, about how fiduciary duty violations were usually handled with slap-on-the-wrist penalties, about how my approach had created actual consequences for behavior that normally got swept under expensive legal carpets. "You turned contract law into a weapon," she said at one point, and she made it sound like I'd discovered fire instead of just being really pissed off and overly prepared. "I turned my paranoia into a business strategy," I corrected, but she waved that off like it was an irrelevant distinction. "Same thing, different motivation," she said. "The point is that you created accountability where none existed before. You proved that if you structure agreements properly, personal conduct and professional responsibility can't be separated." As we talked, I found myself relaxing in a way that I hadn't since before my marriage started falling apart. This wasn't about money or revenge or even justice, really. It was about ideas, about the intellectual challenge of figuring out how legal systems could work better than they currently did. For the first time in months, I felt like I was having a conversation with someone who was interested in me as a person rather than as either a victim to be pitied or a weapon to be feared. Around midnight, she started packing up her notes and preparing to leave, but she paused at the door with the kind of hesitation that suggested she was debating whether to say something that might be professionally inappropriate. "Adrian," she said finally, "would you be interested in guest lecturing for my corporate ethics seminar? I think my students would benefit from hearing about real-world applications of theoretical frameworks. You want me to teach a class about how to destroy your business partners when they sleep with your wife?" I asked, because I wanted to make sure we were both clear about what we were discussing. "I want you to teach a class about how creative contract structure can create accountability in situations where traditional legal remedies are inadequate," she said, but she was smiling when she said it, which suggested that she understood the practical translation of her academic language. "That sounds like it might be fun," I admitted. Meanwhile, across town in Brooklyn, Isabella Torres and her army of idealistic lawyers were putting my $15 million to work in ways that made me feel like I'd accidentally done something worthwhile with my life. The Unity Legal Collective had expanded so fast that they'd had to rent additional office space, hire new staff, and create waiting lists for clients who needed help but couldn't afford the kind of legal representation that usually came with marble lobbies and hourly rates that could fund small countries. Isabella called me every few days with updates that sounded like battle reports from a war against corporate injustice. They'd won a class action lawsuit against a slumlord who'd been illegally evicting tenants. They'd secured workers' compensation for a group of construction workers whose employer had been cutting corners on safety equipment. They'd helped 3 different families avoid foreclosure by challenging predatory lending practices that would have been ignored if the families hadn't had lawyers willing to fight for them. Each victory was small in the grand scheme of Manhattan's legal ecosystem, but they added up to something that felt more meaningful than all the corporate acquisitions and partnership disputes I'd handled in my previous career. These weren't cases about helping rich people get richer or protecting companies from the consequences of their own bad decisions. These were cases about actual people whose lives were being changed by having access to legal representation that gave a damn about justice instead of just billable hours. Investing in Unity Legal felt like the opposite of what I'd done to Richard Garrison. Instead of using money as a weapon to destroy something, I was using it as a tool to build something worth believing in. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I wasn't just surviving betrayal or orchestrating revenge. I was actually building a future. 6 months later, a FedEx envelope arrived that made me do a double take at the return address, Portland, Oregon. Samantha's handwriting, but not the address I expected. I opened it expecting legal documents or another attempt at damage control, but instead found something I'd never expected from her: actual honesty. She was working at a nonprofit immigration clinic in a strip mall, helping families navigate the bureaucratic nightmare of staying in the country they called home. The letterhead looked like it had been designed by someone's teenage nephew, and the office photos she'd included showed her in jeans and sneakers, looking more genuine than I'd seen her in years. "I threw away the best thing I had," she wrote. "Not asking for forgiveness. Just wanted you to know I'm finally different." I folded the letter into my desk drawer next to other documents that had changed my life. No anger left, just distant sadness for what she could have been if she'd figured this out 7 years sooner. That evening, I met Camille for dinner at that same village cafe where Samantha and I had negotiated the press statement. Unity Legal was expanding to 3 boroughs. My lectures were packed with students who actually cared about justice, and for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving betrayal. I was living well beyond it. The best revenge? Making their betrayal completely irrelevant.